All right, we're back here at the table talking about accessible worship. I'm joined with Mike, and I'm Aaron, and today we want to talk about communication, which I think is probably one of the most important parts in this whole worship discussion is...
What is it?
Yeah.
Communication. It's so important, and honestly, the whole idea of accessible worship hinges on this concept, and I think it's a really important one. And I want to take us back, if you've been with us through this video series and you watched the first one, we talked about this whole concept of accessible worship with the gifts and talents and whatever God has given us to make the peace, joy, and hope of the gospel message accessible to as many people in our influence, was born out of two really hard tensions. And I've heard this story repeated any number of times. I've lived it any number of times. And this is, again, the idea of a worshiper coming to a pastor or to a worship leader, somebody who does the worship of the congregation. And they say, it might even be our kids or anything like that, I didn't get anything out of worship today. And that, you say, well, what do you mean by that? How do we make sense of that? So that's one tension. The other one coming from the pastor's standpoint, or the worship leader. I'm a worship leader at my home church in St. Paul's, Muskego, and I travel around the country, so I get this from time to time. I didn't get anything out of worship, and my response, or a pastor's response, might be, why is what I'm doing, or what we're doing, not good enough for you? That becomes the hurt. That's tough. And then the accusation comes, well, you need to do something. You're not getting out of it because you're not putting anything into it. And that's the defensive default that we kind of go on.
I've heard it from both sides, yeah.
Yeah. So that's why this topic of communication, it's going to be technical, and some of you who are theologians are probably going to be a little annoyed by some of this. But I hope that all of us will be able to see that there is a practical application. God did put us in a world. He did give us functions. He did give us materials. He gave us the ability to be artistic and creative to do what? Communicate the story, the history of God's faithfulness to us. So I want to break this down. And you're a movie maker, and so I know that I'm an artistic company here.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to that. There are issues and things and there's screens people naturally have up, and messaging, sometimes it's important that you use the right thing to get through the screen. Yeah, and Jesus did it in his day. He used object lessons in his day with the technology that they had. As technology changes for us, again, how are we aware of how this is changing communication? So I want to give a definition, and then we're going to break it down into some ideas. So this is, by the way, if you're like, do I have time to watch this one? This is going to be a little longer video because this is a really important concept and content to get right. So if you've got questions, leave them in the comments and stuff below. Communication. The idea, the thought that I have an idea, and I have a way of understanding this idea, and I want you to receive it exactly the way that I have it in my mind. I have a picture, and I'm trying to define the picture, and I want you to see the same picture. And it's a little bit like the chain of monkeys. Somebody starts with something, and one word, by the time it gets to the end, it's a completely different story. The telephone game.
The telephone game, yeah. So communication has that idea, and if you look at the relational breakdowns, even our marriage relationships, our family relationships, our work relationships, some of the greatest tension always comes up from poor communication. I don't know if you've seen that. I mean, you do a lot of movie stuff to be able to try to get everybody on the same page, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly difficult, and that's partly knowing the audience and knowing knowing the words that, you're using, or even colors. It's surprising what changes people's perspectives. Little things like colors can be a huge impact.
Right. So how do we apply this to the 1 hour that we say is so important? I mean, after all, again, we have this 1 hour that we say come to church, and we encourage people to go to church. And we're saying, well, why is that important? And again, we've kind of unpacked this already, but the idea that we are here on planet Earth for communion with God through Jesus Christ, and we were put on earth to enjoy community with Him, but also community with one another, built on the foundation of Christ. And the worship service is one of the the unique times where all the different places of life and economic groups and people can come together in a place to commune with God and to have community with one another through Christ. So worship is really, really important, and we're not saying that you can't have that in your car or things like that, but it's this idea of community. Worship is important. Therefore, the communication is important. And here's a kicker that all of us know, but all of us struggle with, is you're not going to make everybody happy. And you're not going to communicate with certain people. I'm not going to communicate very well with certain people. It's just not going to happen. And the question starts to come, why?
Yeah.
So I want to...
True.
True. I want to give you a breakdown, and this comes from, I'll be honest, I have seen a performance coach named Tom Jackson, and other books have been written on this idea too, but one of the things that Tom always would say as somebody who's leading from the front, okay, this is important to understand. I am going to now specifically speak about any time you're leading from the front in a group of people, whether you're a band, a musician, an organist, you're usually in the back of church, but you're still leading things that are happening here. Communication is made up of 3 ideas. And so if you're writing this down, the first one is content. It's the words that we say. It's the words that we sing. It's the words that we print, or it's the words that we text and we type. Content. That is really important. And in fact, we would say it's the most important part of things. What Jesus said, what the Bible says, is the key idea. Amen. And we could stop there, but that's not communication alone. If you look at the percentages, 15% of communication, me getting it to you, you getting it to me, 15% is content. Oh. 15% of that transfer is the words that we say, yet the words are the key, most important piece of things. All right, so there's 85% more to go. So what are the next pieces? Well, the next part is 30% of communication is inflection, voice. It's how words are said. It's how words are sung and framed. So 30% is voice and inflection, going up, going down, being monotone, whatever the case may be. The last one, the one that we would say is most important, 55% of communication is what people see.
Yeah.
And I know, again, filmmaker.
Well, right, but emotions and a lot of those things they say are directly tied to
what people see. And just a couple of real quick examples on this, and then we'll apply it to what we mean and what we don't mean in a worship setting, okay? So one of the movies that came out, the Star Wars movie a couple of years ago, The Force Awakens, I think, that scene where a little robot is kind of tooling through, and it's trying to escape because its master has been captured, and the master's ship blows up, and you see this robot with no content, looks up and looks down and makes a little sound. What was just communicated?
What is said for that robot?
I know, everybody's like got a tear in their eye because a robot went up and down. But within the context of what was 85% of communication happened. We received what they said. You'll see this one. Any parents out there, or any of us who've been parents, or any of us who are children who can remember this, most of us, pretty much everybody, you get caught doing something. And mom and dad say, you need to say, I'm sorry. And they keep badgering you to say, I'm sorry. And finally you go, I'm sorry. Now, let's talk communication. 15% content. Was the content right?
Yeah.
Got it. I'm sorry. We said to say I'm sorry. You said I'm sorry.
Did what you said.
Voice and inflection, 30% of communication. I'm sorry. If we were taking words and actions in the kindest possible way, we might say they were passionate about their I'm sorry. But the 55%, I'm sorry. What did they clearly communicate?
That they're doing this against their will and that they're angry, if anything, Yeah. Not sorry, they're angry.
I'm not sorry, I'm just, yeah. Last example, because this one, relates to a lot of people too. Texting and email. I've always said, and I've made this mistake any number of times, always the email you're going to send to somebody, assume it's going to be read in the worst possible way. Because 15% content is going out, but they don't have inflection and they don't have what they see. So in some respects, 15% of communication gets sent across. Therefore, when you send out a text or an email and you say, hey, how are you doing? You say, I'm fine. People go, what's wrong?
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why you see the rise of emojis right now, because you're giving part of that 55%.
Right.
Oh, and people can relate to a face even if it's a goofy face. I don't know about the poop emoji, but I mean,
right.
like the face emojis are definitely changing communication because of that. People weren't sure what to read from it, and then a face actually helps them. But
yep.
Nevertheless,
and you'll see that built in every social media platform now is the emojis, because they're trying to bring back one of the weaknesses of text and email, and that's
right.
It doesn't help with communication. It actually hurts it. So what does this mean for the idea of accessible worship? I want to go back to that story of the person saying, I didn't get much out of worship, and what do I have to do to have you get something out of worship? You know, or you're just not coming in prepared. I want to submit to us that one of the reasons why worship, the worship wars have been discussed. They happen in every denomination. The differences of how you use liturgy or non-liturgical settings, whether it's an organ or whether it's a band, whether the worship leader's in the front or in the back, all of these conversations, they're good conversations to be had, taking words and actions in the kindest possible way. But let's talk a little bit about why these things matter and why these things are going to reach different kinds of people. And this idea of language is tied a lot to environment. So we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, but I'll just quickly give you the 4 worship languages or 4 worship environments that I see in my travels that I work with. And there's a lot of iterations, but think about this like German and French and Spanish and English, okay? They all have their different dialects that are a little bit different, but generally speaking, you have your traditional, you have your blended, a lot of times mirroring the historicity of the church, a lot of the languages and usages of hymns and things like that, but blending in different worship elements and media and things like that. You have your contemporary settings, which loosely means it's more band-led or piano-led. You might have a worship leader, and then your modern worship setting, primarily spiritual songs rather than hymns. You've got the screens, you've got lighting, things of that nature, and kind of the how the modern communication piece of things is
more experiential
according to that.
In some ways.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Well, when you start putting lights and more audio-related things, I see that as more of an experiential worship.
Yeah, and to the traditionalist, that's not taking away, because there's so much historicity and visual in the traditional piece of things too. So, but what we want you to understand is that again, communication is going to happen differently for different kinds of people. And so when we come into, and I'm just going to use the more extremes just to be able to set the example, because this is one of the tensions that we see frequently. I lead worship at the Bridge at St. Paul's, and I also help out with the contemporary worship that happens inside our church. The Bridge happens in our gym. There's a stage, there's lighting, there's screens, there's seats go out in the gym. There's that environment, and then there's our traditional setting, which has all of the things of the traditional piece, the liturgy and the baptismal font and the altar and the cross, all of those kinds of things. There will be some people who will come who will come from a traditional background, who really appreciate and understand and know the value, or they've assigned a significant value of what worship is supposed to be like to how traditional is enacted. And so when they come into a Bridge setting or a modern setting, it's very distracting. They don't see a lot of things that show a solemnness, or even in some cases a humility, they might argue. The pastor will speak, but he's not wearing a robe, he's moving around, the music is too loud. There's a lot of things, and they would come in, and even though the songs were all about Jesus, and may have all been hymns, the message was all about Jesus, the tendency is that I'm going to walk out and say, I didn't get a lot out of worship today. You flip that, and somebody who is really understands that language. That's the sphere. That's the way that they roll in life. I just want to see worship that reflects what my regular life is like. And so they come to a traditional setting and they see all of the stuff that's there, but they're hearing music and instruments that they don't hear the rest, that they are playing the rest of their week, if you will. There's a robe, there's a pulpit, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance in some of their minds. They would come in, and even though all of the music was about Jesus and all of the preaching was about Jesus, they might walk out and say, I didn't get anything out of worship today. And we see this all the time. And the tendency is to kind of be defensive and say, well, how can I help you get more out of this? Why aren't you getting more out of this? And again, I'm going to come back to the idea of what people see and how people communicate. There are people who love what is in the traditional piece of things. What they see, that environment communicates things to them. Somebody else would come in and says it may communicate something very, very different. Right. Similarly with the bridge.
Night and day on some of these things, it's crazy.
Yeah, and so it's just acknowledging that people are coming from different backgrounds. And so try as I will, I may never write a song that's going to reach every single person. In fact, I'm guaranteed that will never be the case. And so what I would like us to be able to see is the importance of these ideas. And by the way, because I've had a little bit of pushback, the whole idea of what we see. This does not necessarily, I'm not talking about a person's appearance. You know, whether they're skinny or whether they have a beard or whether they're not in shape or whether they have a limp or whether they're younger or they're older. I'm not talking about that kind of appearance when we lead from the front. What it is typically going to be, it's going to be the hand motions and gestures as you're trying to communicate the bigness of God versus I'm trying to communicate the bigness of God versus I'm trying to communicate the bigness of God. All of those have different. They communicate, the content's all the same, but they're all different. So understand that what I'm really talking about is people's use of intonation, people's use of facial expressions, people's use of their hands as they're trying to communicate and explain what they're doing. So I'm not talking about
definitely
outward
not
appearance
or anything like that, for sure. I mean, you look at, in some cases, communication and authenticity, there's signals that people give out. Like I know when we were, doing headshots for people, like if you scrunch your eyes just a little bit, you seem more authentic. And I mean, there's tons of these cues, visual cues, so when talking about what you see, right, it's not, wow, that guy is overweight or, like that stuff really is irrelevant.
Old or young or whatever.
You look at movies, like there's people of all different sizes and stuff, and that's definitely not an issue with trying to communicate. It's always how they, like the things that people use to communicate, their face, their eyes, their hands. Right.
And so this idea of communication, 15% content, which is a little insulting at first.
Yeah.
But when you think about, again, what we're talking, communication, that getting the content as you intend it to that person, getting that there, 15% content, 30% intonation, inflection is how you use your voice. 55% is what people see. It's how your environment, your overall environment, helps you communicate the truth of what you're trying to tell people. One of the ideas too is that, Jesus came to forgive sinners. I am forgiven. Maybe we should smile when that happens, and I'm guilty of this too, because I'm locked in trying to lead on something, and my wife every once in a while reminded me, if you could have smiled, it probably would have been it would have locked it in. Communication, this idea is extremely important, and I think it helps us understand why we attract certain people to our church and our worship services, because we speak a language. Remember what we said before, worship is God coming to us, and His people respond to Him, to one another about Him, and to one another to encourage and live in Him. What happens if your communication style, it's not my natural communication style. It basically is like a foreign language. What if the song that I'm given to sing or the words that I'm given to say aren't mine? And it's not easy for me to be able to sing and to participate. I wind up leaving saying, I didn't get much out of worship. Versus the time when I'm in an environment in which you're speaking I get what you're saying, I can see it, whether you're behind a pulpit or whether you're walking around, you're communicating it. And again, understand this too, because I know I'm talking to pastors. The word works. It is not me. But God has given us tools, and He's given us a craft. And we're encouraged to work on that craft and understanding how important communication is. Some of these things when you work with, I know I've worked with videographers before, and that whole idea of just the smile at the right space changes the entire piece.
Even talking about, the word, if people aren't hearing you, it doesn't matter if you're speaking it. And that's something I worry about sometimes too, where, people are...
Well, I'll step in because I'm going to, just because the Isaiah passage does make the promise that even though they may not hear it, I will accomplish what I intend. So we know that promise is there. Our encouragement in this whole idea of accessible worship is that we would just understand that there is a reason why why I as an individual reach a certain group of people, or why our worship environment tends to help a certain group of people and not another group of people. Right. Because it's harder for them to get what you're saying because of how communication happens, and what we give them to say back to God might not be their natural language that they speak.
And some of that's cultural and generational. You look at some people would prefer to have things in, like we were talking about, more of that traditional, because for them that is very that signifies its importance. Yeah. Whereas some people would find like that nature would maybe be incompatible with their idea of authenticity or like their passion for it. And it's interesting. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, and that's why I think it's so important that we actually talk about that and we give each other the opportunities to be successful with the cultures and the generations we're dealing with. When we start saying mine is the way, then that means all those other cultures and generations don't get to have what their language is, their communication language. And so I think it's important. That's an important point that you're making. Otherwise, and if we don't give permission to each other to engage in the communication styles that our people we're trying to serve are seeking to use, then we're not being the best we could be. We're
missing an opportunity, and we're not celebrating, quite frankly, the variety of different ways that we do this. So we're almost out of time on this, and thank you if you've made it this far. Thank you for sticking around. Again, our hope is this idea: worship is God coming to us as people respond. Understand that idea is, there's a big part of this reality of communication. It's a God-given gift that we've been given to communicate with one another. And our hope is that it would spur on a conversation so that the worship that we do in the variety of places, whether you are traditional or blended or contemporary or modern, and in all the different dialects, if you will, underneath that we could encourage and spur one another on. Iron sharpens iron, that we would communicate the gospel story and the gospel history and the reality of this well with our unique audiences and celebrate those things rather than really spend time tearing each other down. In order to kind of continue this conversation, just to give us some things to think about, we're going to, in the next couple videos, we're going to talk about words that matter, words that have been kind of thrown around that usually have a lot of negative connotation, and we want to reclaim those. Satan has used them to throw darts at one another. I would like to see us reclaim these. And again, there are doctrinal differences that are really, really important as we're going to bring these things up. Some things we're not going to be compatible on, but some of the words that we're using, we'd like to reclaim them and find the love of Christ in them and apply them to this idea so that when we're in our different environments, we're doing this well. If you have questions, thoughts, comments, I'm not sure where we're posting all of this, but
they'll be
around in different places.
In all the platforms that we're posting this on, for sure. This is a chance for us to have those conversations and to communicate with each other. Although it'll be over text, so I definitely encourage you guys, again, either to use emojis or just try to be extra careful with how you speak about this stuff, because there are people's passions on the line, passions to reach people with the gospel, and they don't need to be torn down. They need to be encouraged and lifted up. So.
And that's a great point. I'd just like to further that. By no means are we saying, hey, you're not doing enough. You're not good enough. No. We're not saying that at all. We're all in a process. We will be in a process until the day we die. What we're saying is excellence is not a destination, it's a journey. And every time you accomplish a place where you're like, yes, I arrived, God says, awesome, here's another space and step for you to go. I'm hoping that this is something that spurs you on and actually encourages you to, if you've had struggles in your church or if you've had struggles with a church that you're going to, that this might help you ask answer the question, why am I not getting anything out of worship? What am I really trying to, what am I asking God to do through us in this church? And what am I hoping and praying for? This might give us some ways to be able to have that conversation better.
So, well, on that note, we'll leave you with that cliffhanger, what words we want to reclaim next time. But make sure to comment below, and we will see you in the next video.